Hello, so today it is a bit special video. I'm going to share with you a sort of introduction to Madame dAulnoy's work and life. I have started to work on her characters few weeks ago. It's something I do on a regular basis. I've started my very first White Cat Castle in 2011, I think. So I really love her fairy tales very much, and every certain amount of years I like to go back to her work and her stories. And this year I wanted to go back to her work, but trying to explore more fairy tales than I have previously done. In the past I mainly worked on White Cat, so I worked on many scenes from White Cat, and I also did the dollhouse, the White Cat dollhouse in 2011. I did a carousel too, and many more things. And this year I'm back to White Cat, but also other fairy tales like the Benevolent Frog, for example. I've started to work also on this fairy tale. These characters are going to arrive in my shop. Some have already arrived, some are going to arrive a little later, and I really plan to work on these stories for quite some time. So you're going to hear more of her fairy tales. But before that, I thought it would be maybe really nice to hear a bit more about her life, because she had quite an extraordinary life, and the context of her fairy tales, which are really special, and you may not have heard of them before, and it's pretty normal. They're not so famous nowadays, mainly not very published, so it's the reason. You may easily find old publications, old books from the 70s, the 80s and earlier, but in the recent years it's pretty hard to find new editions of her fairy tales. So I will ask you to wear your high heels, a beautiful dress, and we are going to visit Madame dAulnoy in her castle, in her sanctuary, and try to meet her in person and see a bit who she was. Who was this lady who wrote all these beautiful fairy tales? So she was born in 1650 or 1651, we are not really sure. So really at the middle of the 17th century. And she died at 54, I think, if I'm correct. So she really lived during the second part of the 17th century. It's really the century of the Baroque era, of magic, of the beginning of the opera, and all these beautiful entertainments. Louis XIV made all his most crazy things at this time. And you can't really forget that she lived in this chunk of time, because it explains a lot of things in her imagination, in her stories, all the metamorphoses you can see in her fairy tales all the time. There are a lot of things which are totally related to this Baroque mindset, the Baroque imagination, and the Baroque philosophy, really, which you have to go always further. There are no limits of any kind. It's just the opposite of minimalism, where we are living a bit today. It's just the other way around. And it's the reason why I feel very comfortable in this era, because I'm not very comfortable in minimalism. And you can tell Madame dAulnoy's fairy tales are absolutely not minimalistic. They are just the other way around. It's the maximum of details, of transformation, metamorphosis, description, stories in a story. In a story, you always have different other drawers with other stories inside. That's something I really like. So before we go back to her fairy tales, where you could try to find some real books, if you love real books too, not digital versions. We will talk about that at the end of the video, but before that I really would like to go back to her life. So she was born in Normandy in a castle, which is Barneville, le Château de Barneville. I've never been in this place of Normandy, but Normandy is not far from Brittany. It's part of France where you have, of course, a lot of legends, of stories, magic, not far from the Celtic world. So I suppose this thing must have nourished her imagination when she was small. She lived in a beautiful castle. It seems the nature and everything around her seems to have been very pretty, so it can maybe explain where everything came from. She was married very early. She was a teenager, and very unhappy with her husband, who was a libertine, who spent all his money on hers, and she was really miserable. So at a certain point, her and her mother, she was always attached to her mother, they tried to organize a big strategy to make him dead, really, to kill him, and to make him put in jail. So they tried to make him accused of lèse-majesté crime, which is just the worst at this time. And he was put in jail. Everything could have been really, really bad for him, but at the end it was proved he was innocent. So the two men who helped Madame dAulnoy and her mother to put her husband to jail, these two men were beheaded because they were proved to be guilty, and Madame dAulnoy and her mother had to leave the country really fast because they could have also had some problems. So they have been traveling for many, many years. It seems Madame dAulnoy's mother was a spy in Spain, was a spy for the court. They all had really unbelievable lives, really. It's very, very strange. Madame dAulnoy seemed to have been in jail too for a while. It's not really sure where and when. It seems it was at La Conciergerie in Paris. La Conciergerie is a place where I had a castle show many years ago. You can see that on my website, on my exhibition section. This place was really magical for me because it was related to a lot of persons I really like, and Madame dAulnoy seemed to have been in jail in this very prison, which is a sort of beautiful building now, but at the time it was a prison. So she seemed to have been there in this place for a while. We have no news of her for 20 years. We don't know what she did. She seemed to have traveled a lot. We need to make her forget because she could have been back in jail and maybe beheaded too, like her lover and the man who helped her many years ago. So she had disappeared for many years. She probably wrote during this time. I suppose she always wrote, and she came back to France and then she started to write her first novel and her fairy tales. And in 1690 there was this big trend of fairy tales. Fairy tales were really the big trend, the literary big trend at the time. And everyone was trying to write things, but Madame dAulnoy was the very first writer, a lady writer, to publish her fairy tales. Before Charles Perrault in France is the master of fairy tales. When you think about fairy tales in France, it's always Charles Perrault you think of. It's not even Grimm or all the other writers who came much later. It's Charles Perrault who in 1692, I'm not really sure, 1691, 1692, he also published his fairy tales, his first fairy tales. And now he's really the king of fairy tales, but at the time it was Madame dAulnoy. She was even more famous than him. So it's quite interesting to know that now she's so almost forgotten. Nobody really in France, maybe in children, few people know her, but it's not, you could ask someone in the street if they know her, they would say no, because she's not really published anymore, because her fairy tales are a bit long, and maybe they're not really considered well suited for children, maybe. I don't really know, it's very strange, but at the time it was not the case. Something also very important to understand when you start to read her fairy tales is to understand that they were written for adults. It was a grown-up entertainment, these fairy tales. It was made for ladies, aristocrats, who had time and leisure and who wanted to be entertained with beautiful stories. They were not always reading boring essays and all that. We always think at the time they were all, I imagine that sometimes, but no, they love the fantasy and all that, as we always have in every century. So there was this big trend of fairy tales, and of course a really need of that. So the publisher who published Madame dAulnoy was a bookstore and a publisher at the same time was sold his books so quickly. There were all the ladies who came, the aristocrats and all the beautiful gentry, if you will, who came to buy the fairy tales book in his store, and they were sold so fast. So it's interesting to know that it was probably like Harry Potter nowadays, who knows, it was probably something similar to that, but they were made for grown-ups who loved them, and they had to be well written and well crafted. It was really an art to make these fairy tales. So Madame dAulnoy at this time also had a literary salon, a salon littéraire, that a lot of lady writers had during the century in France. It started at the end of the 17th century. They were also in the 18th, 19th centuries. So most of the lady writers and all that were always sort of involved in that. And Madame dAulnoy had this salon littéraire. Other lady writers who also wrote fairy tales, or the sort of literary genre maybe, could come and share their ideas and all that. And it's really a tradition in the French literature to have this salon littéraire where you could talk and exchange beautiful conversations and all that. It's really the art of conversation too. So Madame dAulnoy had a very popular salon littéraire. She was really acclaimed and seen as a very good author, though it was fairy tales. But now the fairy tale genre was really noble. It was not something really as it is now, just for children, things like that. Not at all. You can really tell when you read her fairy tales that they were made also for adults. There were a lot of satirical lines here and there. There were a lot of funny things too, which could only be understood by adults. I really love that. In The Benevolent Frog, there is a moment, I'm not going to read the exact line, but she talks about the king who is going to save the queen. The king has done all he could to save the queen, who is in jail in the crystal palace on the Quicksilver Lake, and is going to try all he can for several years to try to save her. And she has this line where she said, it's really a fairy time, just a long time before now, when really husband could do this thing for their wives. She has a line like that. Of course, you understand it doesn't happen anymore. She has a very funny line about, because also she was very unhappy with her husband, so we can understand why she said that. So you can see a lot of these things. There were a lot of humor too. It's very funny. I think there are a lot of moments. You can tell she enjoyed writing her stories. It was not only something made to impress or to entertain. She truly enjoyed them, and she played with words. She was a real good writer. So with the English translation, I have not read the other translation, but I have seen few English translation. You lose a lot, as always in translation, of course. When I read Shakespeare in French, I lose a lot too, for sure. You don't have all the juicy effect of the language. She creates words all the time. She changes words all the time. She has an amazing freedom with the language, which is fascinating, I think. Just for the word frog, for example, in The Benevolent Frog, she uses so many different words, and funny words too, really cute words. She will say grenouillette, which doesn't exist really. It's a little grenouille, a little frog, but she's going to say grenouillette, and she's going to play and to create all sorts of impossible words which didn't exist. So she wrote 25 fairy tales during her lifetime, so probably wrote them even during her mystery years when we had no idea what she was doing, and then she published them pretty fast in a very few years. And she was the first to call really fairy tales, like one of her books was Les Fées à la mode et Contes de Fées, fairy tales. Charles Perrault, who was the other author, called them Contes de ma mère Loi. There were no fairy tales, and she has a lot of fairies in her stories, by the way, so it's not really strange that she called them this way, maybe even more than in Charles Perrault fairy tales. So what makes her fairy tales so special? I'm going to just explain a few things. I don't want this video to be too long, but there are so much to say. First, they are very special because she's an amazing writer. That's her style. Her 17th century style makes everything. It's really something you can tell. She plays with the language all the time. She creates new words all the time. And she obviously enjoyed the language. So that's something first which makes them very different from Charles Perrault and the other writers later. Even Madame le Prince de Beaumont, who was not the author, the real author of The Beauty and the Beast, by the way. We will come back to that a little later in another video, because this lady took everything from another lady. So it's another case of plagiat, as we call in French. Or maybe she just swallowed everything another lady wrote and tried to put her name under her fairy tale. But we will talk about that another time. Her style is really special, really specific, totally recognizable in a second. What I really love too is her description. It's a lady who writes, and you can totally tell in the description of clothes, of little details. She goes into details all the time, I don't think Perrault doesn't do that at all, and other men fairy tale writers would do that the same way. You can tell she's really sharing things on a feminine point of view sometimes, the way she describes everything, especially the costume or the portraits of characters and all that. She has an unbelievable imagination. There are so many striking ideas. We have now, in this year, in 2018, we have swallowed so many fantasy things from the past centuries, the past 50 years, in films, literature, books, everywhere. We are surrounded by that. So it's a bit hard to make us surprised, I think. And maybe when you read her fairy tales, you would think, oh, okay, a crystal castle on a Quicksilver Lake is not a strange idea after all, but you have to remember it's the end of the 17th century. There is nothing like that written before. It's amazing. A crystal palace on a Quicksilver Lake. I find that just amazing. Surrounded by monsters who are keeping the castle safe. This scene from the benevolent frog is amazing. I love that. It's all dark. There are a lot of dark things in her fairy tales, so if you like the dark part, you will enjoy her stories very much, because there are a lot of dark side in the benevolent frog. So you have this side with this sort of, how we could say that, a very dark kingdom, if you will, which is managed by Laetitia, the lion fairy, she has a very nice description of the lion fairy, by the way. And she has this totally dark kingdom, and all the monsters were bad people from the other world, kings, queens, all that, who are now monsters in this world. There are crows, owls, all sorts of characters surrounding this Quicksilver Lake. And this is beautiful, this is amazing, written such a long time ago, where there was no fantasy really. There were the legends, there were the mythology, all that, but that's all. And she created all that from her mind. It's unbelievable. Even if she took, of course, the same theme like in Cinderella, in Sleeping Beauty, there are themes you can recognize from time to time. Of course, you can see, okay, she took this piece of fairy tale that everybody knew of, and she made her totally different. She added a lot of things. There were a lot of animals, a lot of animals. The fairies have every shapes possible also, which I really like. So I like to imagine her writing her stories of frog, where the frog are talking, all that, dressed in her 17th century dress, with her shoes near maybe a fire with a candlelight, and writing these stories. I like to imagine her like that, and just going away on a dragon, on her amazing fairy tales. There are a lot of dragons too. The dragons are talking, always in a very elegant way, which I really like. I'm going to work on these fairy tales for quite some time. I'm really inspired by these stories, this magic, this unbelievable imagination. I admire imagination so much, and I think when you read them, you cannot help thinking, wow, this Madame dAulnoy has such beautiful ideas. It's really unusual. So I'm going to work on that, and I wanted to inspire you maybe to read them too. I've heard from here and there that Helen showed me the books she found. She found beautiful editions of White Cat, and she showed me the pictures, and I thought, whoa, they are beautiful. You can really find beautiful old editions online on websites like AB Books. If you know this website, it's a website for all books from all over the world, and I found a lot of nice things on this website. You can really find everything you want. You can just put the price you want, the country you want to buy it from, all that, and it will give you all the editions available, and you can find maybe very nice old ones maybe, or more recent ones which are really pretty from the 70s or the 80s. It has not been published recently. I don't know any good edition of Madame dAulnoy stories published recently, but you can for sure find old ones online, or maybe in an old bookstore you have in your area, or online for sure. And you will be amazed by these stories. I've heard too that another person told me that she has a boyfriend who is reading White Cat every evening to her before she sleeps, and I think such a beautiful idea to go back to sleep with White Cat story being told to you. That's such a beautiful thing. I love that. So if you have some stories, some things you have to share with me about discovering maybe Madame dAulnoy stories, reading her fairy tales, let me know. I would love to know that. I hope I inspired you to read her and to try to know her more. I definitely want to go on a trip to see a bit where she lived, what she has done, all that. It's something I want to do. Maybe going in Normandy, in Paris, where she lived. I have few informations, and I hope to do that in the future. I've done that for other authors and musicians and artists. I love to do that because I think you can't fully understand and enjoy an artist or writer's work, books or art without knowing a bit of them. You can't really enjoy that so much, especially when it is everything is related. And in that case, for the 17th century, everything is also related to this part of history, of literary history, and it's interesting to know all that. So about books, I wanted to show you this book. I had found it on this website, AB Books. I don't know how you pronounce it in English, it depends. It's a website where you can find all sorts of amazing old books. And I had found this edition. And my goal is to try to find the other tomes, if you will, the other volumes of this series. This series has 4, 5, 6 fairy tales by Madame dAulnoy, and it was published in 1745, which is really quite good. I really love 18th century books, are my favorite. They are a bit harder to find than the 19th edition, of course, but the paper is just great, the quality is great. You have, of course, to remember when you are reading such a book to change all the F for S, because I don't know if it existed in English too. I think so, but let me know if it existed, where the F and the S are the same letter. The F is used instead of the S. For example, here, une fille agréable nouvelle, which you have to pronounce une si agréable nouvelle. So you have to, in your mind, change that. I have no idea why they made that. I tried to find that online and I wasn't successful. I couldn't understand why they used the F. I think it was for just a beautiful effect. I'm not really sure. But it makes sometimes the work to read a little challenging at the beginning. So my goal is really to try to find the other books of this series, or a closer series of the middle of the 18th century. 17th century is just too hard to find, but if I could find something, I just love when you have this thing avec privilège du roi, which is, in that case it would be Louis XV, the king who was there. It was not Louis XIV anymore, who was dead, but it's quite a piece of history. I think this book is the oldest thing I have in my home, because it was made in 1745. I have no other objects of furniture or anything which would be that old, so it makes it so special and so precious. You always have joy reading that. I love going back to them very often, just always carefully for sure. I love the sound of paper, and I love the little decor here where they are all different. I love paying attention to that. This decor is different from this one. They're all a bit different, so it makes this book so special. I don't have any illustrations, of course, there. In the 18th century, you don't have a lot anyway. I didn't find a lot who had. But yes, it's just a travel in time. I bought this one many years ago, and I hope to find the other volumes in the future to have the complete collection. And this one had few pages missing. It's the reason I could buy it. It was a little less expensive, because 18th century fairy tale books, or books in general, are not exactly in the same realm than the 19th century books. They're a bit more difficult to find, a bit more expensive, but when you can find one which has a little flaw somewhere, it makes it way more affordable. So this one is my first of my Madame dAulnoy series, but I also had another edition, which is a 19th century edition. Thank you for watching this little video. So this was just an introduction to Madame dAulnoy and Madame dAulnoy's fairy tales. White Cat Eating Her Mice Bisque is on my shop, and the Benevolent Frog also arrived a few days ago. She found a home, but I will have other characters also coming in the upcoming weeks. They will all made only once. I'm asked sometimes this question if I do copies, things like that. I really hate doing that. So they are all made only once, and I will go from one fairy tale to another. So you're going to see many other characters, and maybe not the 24 or 5 fairy tales by Madame dAulnoy will be inspired, will be used as an inspiration, but many of them for sure. So you will see that in the upcoming weeks. So I thank you very much for watching this video. You can subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss the next ones. I will have the Bed Canopy Part 2 coming soon. I didn't forget all that. It's all coming. I do really my best. I will try to find my rhythm. This spring was a bit messy, but I will try to find my rhythm now. And I hope you will have a beautiful Easter. I had zero time to do any Easter video this year, so I will try to do a spring video, a spring decor video a little later to show you that, because I was a bit frustrated. I couldn't do anything for Easter, but I hope to do something funny for spring. Thank you very much. Share with me your comments about fairy tales, what you like. Have you read her fairy tales? Are you inspired to read them? Have you found super nice copies, old books of her stories? I would love to know that too. And for now, I leave you here and I wish you a happy Easter.